The purpose of this evening is pretty simple. We're here to discuss the proposed new Pastoral Act for South Australia and to present various perspectives on the key issues. So it's a chance to learn more from the key stakeholders and also later on in proceedings to ask questions of them as well. Welcome to all of those who have travelled afar. I was looking at the list this afternoon and there are some really well-known pastoral family names on the list, and I know some have travelled vast distances to get here. So thank you very much for being here. It's important that you are, and we're delighted to have you. I'd also like to welcome media colleagues here as well. I am aware that in the room we have the Stock Journal, the Country Hour is here as well, the Advertiser, and there was some talk of, and I think they are here, there was some talk of ABC News sending a crew as well. So the media is certainly interested in this. Now, how's this going to work tonight? Let me tell you what the format is going to be. After I stop talking, we're going to hear for 5 minutes from each of our panellists tonight about where they're coming from, what their perspective is on the proposed new Act. At the end of that, we're going to have about a half an hour of facilitated conversation with me essentially asking questions and our panellists bouncing off each other, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. And then the last half hour is an opportunity for you to actually ask questions. So hopefully by the time we walk out of here at about 7:30, we will have covered all bases. I should also say that this is a sellout. There were people who have been turned away from this, and as a consequence, this afternoon we've managed to scramble to get up a live stream of this event. So if you are at home, wherever that might be, and I know there were some people in the pastoral country who were hoping to see a live stream, welcome to this forum as well. It's great to have you online and part of the conversation as well. And clearly there is a high level of public interest in this. I think the fact that it is a sellout and that we are streaming says all of that. Now, of course, it's notable that the state government is not here tonight. The Minister had a prior obligation in Clare. He is actually up there doing some awards tonight, as I believe is the Leader of the Opposition too, Susan, and that's fair enough. And according to Simon Price, the Chief of Staff for David Basham, the Minister for Primary Industries, he said that they couldn't send anybody else. And I pressed him on that when we were talking on the phone. And look, essentially, to cut to the chase, he said, the timing wasn't right. I'll leave you to make whatever sense you would like of that. However, the Minister did want to send a message tonight. We have a little video. It runs for 2.5 minutes. We'll let you see it now.
Welcome to everyone in attendance. I apologise I cannot be there in person, but I'm currently in Clare for the Regional Showcase Awards. I want to give you a brief overview on the process the government is undertaking in reviewing the Pastoral Act. No decisions on the final Pastoral Act have been made as yet, and when they do so, it will be having taken into consideration a large number of submissions and verbal feedback I have received. South Australia's pastoral rangelands are a critical economic driver and cover over 40% of the state with more than 300 individual pastoral leases. The current Pastoral Act is more than 30 years old and no longer adequately addresses many of the aspects of South Australia's pastoral lands. The intent of the new legislation is to improve the future of the pastoral leases, to support pastoral activities and provide more effective conservation of environmental values with enhanced compliance powers. I recently attended a carbon farming forum in Port Augusta, where I welcomed a new report into the benefits of carbon farming could have in South Australia's pastoral region. The report states there are only 3 projects registered with the Emissions Reduction Fund in South Australia's pastoral region compared to hundreds interstate. A core aim of the new Act is sustainable economic resilience for the pastoral sector, including supporting alternative land uses and diversification opportunities such as carbon farming. To get a full benefit, farming agreements for carbon farming require longer lease terms of up to 100 years. Current legislation has proven to be inadequate to capitalise on such diversification opportunities. One critical change proposed in the new bill is to address the backlog of on-ground partial lease assessments by following the use vegetation mapping technology to provide regular monitoring of pastoral land and stock management. We recognise the majority of pastoral leases have demonstrated through their actions over many years a firm commitment to the conservation of pastoral lands. We are confident this responsible approach will continue for years to come. Our reforms are intended to provide stronger conservation of the rangelands, easier ability to undertake alternative land uses that are complementary to pastoralism businesses, and to improve the future of rangelands and the people who live in them. Thank you and enjoy your evening.
Well, thank you, Minister. I'm not sure about you, but I've got about half a dozen questions already out of what he just said then, and I'm going to ask some of our panellists those questions a little bit later on. So let's get into it. I'm going to introduce them to you now in order from my left. It's heading down the aisle. First is Joe Keynes. Joe is the President of Livestock SA, the body which represents the sector in this state and which is involved in negotiations on the Act on behalf of pastoralists. Now, Joe runs livestock down at Avenue Range in the southeast. He got burnt out in that fire recently, so he's more than busy at home, and it's been a difficult summer, Joe. Our sympathies to you. Joe's also an award-winning farmer, a long-time supporter of land care in this state, and a very hard-working advocate for agriculture. A fine farmer and a good bloke, and a fellow who I've known for many years. Joe, thank you very much for being here tonight. The Honourable Dr. Susan Close is the Deputy Opposition Leader here in South Australia. Susan, thank you for being here. And amongst other portfolios, she is the Shadow Minister for Environment and Water, so very fitting that she's here with us this evening. Susan is a past Executive Director of the South Australian Environment Department. She's chaired the Parliamentary Committee on Sustainable Farming Practices, and from what she said to me in conversation, I know that she's very pleased to be here as well and to hear what people are thinking and feeling about this particular piece of legislation. Next to Susan is Joshua Haynes. Joshua hails from the Inner Minka region up in the far northeast of our state. This is a very well-credentialed fellow. Joshua does so many things. I've just cherry-picked a couple of them. He's just been on the Wallaby literally for 14 days doing a whole bunch of jobs around outback Australia, but he's director of the National Native Title Council, chair of the Maori and Inner Minka NRM group. He's a director of the Cooper and Eromanga Basin Aboriginal Executive Committee. He's been treasurer and spokesperson for the First Nations South Australian Aboriginal Corporation and a bunch of other things as well. Joshua is speaking here tonight on his own behalf, not on behalf, I should say, Joshua, of all of the Indigenous population of South Australia, but nevertheless, I'm sure you'll give us a really good perspective, and you have travelled to get here, so thank you for coming down as well. Next to Joshua is Associate Professor Patrick O'Connor, who is here representing the conservation sector this evening. He's currently the President of the Nature Conservation Society of South Australia. His day job is with the Centre of Global Food and Resources in the Faculty of Professions at the University of Adelaide. That's a mouthful. Try and say that half a dozen times quickly. Now, Patrick describes himself as an ecologist, but one who is more keenly interested in the economics of the game. Have I got that right, Patrick? Good. He says he's passionate about the use of evidence and inclusive social processes in decision-making for environmental management. And Patrick was also very enthusiastic when I rang him up and asked him if he'd like to participate. There was no hesitation. He said, yes, count me in. Next to Patrick is Michael Mcbride AM. Michael is a pastoral legend, again, a bloke who I've known for a very long time. He's a long-serving advocate of agriculture in this state through multiple organisations over many years. Michael's been a key member of the Pastoral Board for nearly 3 decades in this state, so he knows these issues like nobody else. He brings the corporate knowledge to this room tonight, and that included nearly a decade as the chair of the Pastoral Board of South Australia as well. Michael was intimately involved with the introduction of the scientific assessment process that's been happening on pastoral lands as part of the process to renew since the last Act was established. And I know this for a fact because he said it to me a number of times over the years that Michael believes that in this state, we manage our pastoral lands better than any other part of the country, and that is a good thing to know from somebody who really should know about it. And Michael, of course, is a stalwart of Rural Media and Communicators SA and NT. He never misses a meeting, this bloke. He turns up like clockwork. Michael, great to have you here tonight. Next to Michael is Trevor Wright, and if you haven't met Trevor before, I'm sure you've probably heard him at some stage because he does tend to get on the air a fair bit. Trevor is from William Creek up on the Oodnadatta track. He owns Wright's Air, amongst other things, and the William Creek Hotel, the caravan park, pretty much William Creek, Trevor owns it. And he's a hell of a pilot. He's been a great mentor, I know, for many young pilots over the years who have come up and worked with him and learnt really the art of flying in the outback of Australia. He's a one-man promotional machine, really, when it comes to the outback of South Australia, very regularly appearing on radio and television, and every time Lake Eyre gets half a drop of water in it, Trevor's on the air talking about it. And I've known him for donkey's years. In actual fact, at one stage, when I was with the ABC, we did a broadcast for the first time from the edge of Lake Eyre. Trevor jumped in a ute and brought a generator out to us and a guest for the program so that we could broadcast the program literally from the edge of Lake Eyre on a wing and a prayer. So welcome to you, Trevor Wright. Great to have you here. And last but not least is Greg Chase. Greg is the president of the Four-Wheel Drive Association of South Australia. Greg tells me he's had multiple roles in the organisation over the years, as well as other clubs, and he's also the current treasurer of the National Four-Wheel Drive Association as well, and of course represents people who like to get out there and enjoy public access into these parts of Australia. So Greg Chase, welcome to you. Now, what I'm going to do is ask each of our guests to talk for up to 5 minutes, but no more than 5 minutes, about where they're coming from on this proposed new act, what their thoughts are. So I'm going to go sequentially down the line, and as I've said to you all beforehand, once we get to that 5 minute mark, I'm going to wind you up very, very quickly so that we can then get down to some serious conversation. So Joe Keynes, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks. Thanks, Lee. Yeah, I don't know that I need to be first came off the rank, but anyway, that's as it is. I'd actually just want to highlight that the pastoralism has been the major dominant industry of our rangelands for over 100 years and will continue to be for the next 100 years. That is, I think...
Well, you're not turned on, I don't think, Joe, that's the problem. Just to make sure everyone can hear you.
There.
I'm not deducting this from your time either, Joe, so go hard.
Anyway,
Now we've got you.
All right. As I was saying, that pastoralism has been the dominant industry. It has been the major industry in the rangelands for over 100 years and will continue to be for over 100 years. That is, I think, is a genuine fact. I think the other, so that's the first thing I think we've got to acknowledge and ensure that that continues to be the case. There are, and obviously, given all the interests here, there are other interests and there are lots of other ancillary enterprises that can be attracted to the rangelands, and we need to ensure that we as a group have good conversations to support pastoralism, but also acknowledge that there are some real opportunities to be had within the rangelands. So I'll just do that as an opener. And I guess the pastoral industry, which Livestock SA represents, welcomes a review of the current Act. There's no doubt we've been very adamant that that's been a great initiative of the current government. Over the recent past, the current Act has started to fail to meet the needs of pastoralists or land managers in general. The 1989 Act fails to contemplate many of the contemporary issues and land uses of the 2020s and has little chance of having relevance in the future as we further go down. The key issue we have is surety. The current Act has failed to give this in recent years in assessment timeframes. The timeframes of assessment are 14 years, it's blowing out to 20 years plus. So pastoralists don't have any confidence that their lease is going to be renewed, so that actually has problems with seeking finance and ongoing commitment to that property. And this is resulting in active lease terms for as little as 20 years. So I guess the issue around longer lease terms provides security of tenure for lessees and enables long-term business and family succession planning. Longer-term leases allow for greater flexibility for alternative land uses in emerging industries, and you heard the Minister talking about carbon farming, and who knows what comes on down the track. The proposed bill gives the surety that we need that our pastoralists need to allow them to plan around finance succession and entering into long-term agreements. We are determined to ensure that these assessment processes are improved. While we welcome the proposal to adopt modern monitoring regimes, and we might talk about that a bit more later on, we believe the current system must be continued and adequately funded, and that is a key point. There has been a rundown of funds, and the pastoral unit hasn't had the ability to undertake its duties over the last numbers of years because it's just been run down. But we are confident that there will be a new system developed that will allow us to do really in-time assessments of properties in the rangelands. You know, you've got all of this new technology, the satellites and artificial intelligence, remote sensing, algorithms that can actually monitor properties week by week, fortnight by fortnight. And so the rolling tenure that we actually agree with the 10-year assessment process. So it's currently 14 and not being done very well. We think with the new system, once we have the confidence and we see the colour of it, which we haven't seen yet, once we have the
30
confidence...
seconds, Joe.
Once we have the confidence in that, we think that the assessment of the rangelands will be far, far superior to what it currently is. We are actually also very much in favour of maintenance of the stocking maximums. There's been a lot of press around that Livestock SA or the pastoralists are not with that, but they certainly are. We've just got to remember that most of the rangelands are family businesses and they need support.
Thank you, Joe Haynes. Now, Susan, don't feel obliged to stand up, but if you want to,
I'm
you
a
do whatever
politician.
you like.
We prefer to stand at all opportunities. Thank you very much for inviting me tonight. And as I said, I was excited when I saw the message come in that Peter wasn't able to, and could I step in? Yes, please. The rangelands are the most precious, most fragile, most beautiful part of South Australia. To me, the rangelands tell us that we are South Australian. They are unique and to be prized. Now, when we talk about the need for a new bill, a reform of the arrangements by which we take care of the rangelands through pastoral management, my immediate question is, what is it that's not working now that might need to work better? Now, I should point out that the Labor Party is yet to make a judgment about what it thinks about the new legislation, simply because there is no legislation before us. There's a draft bill, there's consultation, and we will wait until we see the final version of the bill that the government brings forward before we make a final decision. So what I come with tonight is a series of questions about what is the purpose of this reform and what are the reason for some of the features of the reform that we've been hearing about. If we're thinking about why, after 30 years, and I know it was a bitter fight and argument and debate that resolved in the form of the current legislation, if we're thinking that now that needs to be revisited, I would expect us to be asking questions about the traditional owners, the First Nations people, and I should acknowledge that we're on Kaurna land meeting today, and I apologise for not doing that earlier. But there are traditional peoples who have a connection to and a deep cultural affiliation to and understanding of most, if not all, of the rangelands. So if we're going to revisit 30 years on, is there room for us to talk about the relationship between the First Nations peoples and the land? Where is the understanding of the impact of climate change on the management of the rangelands? Our understanding has moved on a lot in the last 30 years, and I would expect to see that. I haven't seen either of those appear in the discussions that we've been hearing from the government. What I have heard is that there are concerns, and it's been repeated today, about the tenure, whether the current 42-year lease period is sufficient. And I understand part of the pressure on that is because there have been delays in the 14-year rolling investigations. That would seem to me to be a resourcing question rather than a legislative question. I wonder why, when it is public land owned by the public but leased on the long term to pastoralists, why we would effectively give that land away, because 100 years is as close as you can get to freeholding without actually freeholding. So I have questions about the merits of that, the costs of that, the economic impact for the pastoralists and the benefits that they have, and the question of whether that is going to be reflected in rents or not. I don't know. I have questions about the way in which we respond to these new and emerging markets. I appreciate that there is an argument that carbon farming is necessary, that the 100 years is necessary in order to facilitate carbon farming. And yet I understand that 20 to 25-year leases are exactly what are used for carbon farming, that understanding what the likely cost of carbon beyond that period is remote, and therefore there isn't a market for 100-year leases at present, that it is much more in that shorter time frame which can currently be encompassed by the legislation. So I want to understand why it is that that's being used as an argument for the 100-year lease. I also want to understand why properties that are being managed for conservation are being proposed to no longer be under this Act. And finally, I'd like to understand how this interacts with the Landscape SA Act. I have heard that there is legal advice that suggests that the objects of the Landscape SA Act, which are all about integrated land use so that we can make sure that there is a productive use of land, that families living on these properties and earning their income from these properties are able to continue to do so, but alongside making sure that we're maintaining the environment for the long term, true sustainability. They are the objects of the Landscape Act, and yet what I hear is that there is legal advice that that is not going to be compatible with the current construction of the draft legislation for the pastoral lands, and therefore that the objects would not be applied to pastoral lands should that piece of legislation go on. And I wonder why that would be a step forward after 30 years of the current system. So thank you very much. Look forward to hearing the rest. Maybe some of my questions will be answered. If not, I'm sure we'll have a discussion afterwards.
Susan Close, thank you very much. Joshua Haynes, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I believe there has to be some key issues addressed when it comes to traditional owners and their rights. Of course, traditional owners will continue. Sorry?
We can't quite hear you, Joshua.
Sure, that's all right.
I don't think the
Of
lapel's
course,
working
traditional
well.
owners will continue to support pastoralists, which we share our lands with, and we will not be opposed in any of that development that goes on. But unfortunately, we weren't really consulted in this whole area. And that's a bit of a lack and a disappointment for the current government, which they should have stood up and actually had a bit of an Indigenous voice, of course, in this whole area. And there really needs to be more of an open and transparent discussion involved when it comes to traditional owners being involved in having a say. I mean, if we're moving 100 years into the future, we just don't know how much traditional owners will have much more of an impact on different governments as they come back and forth. We have elections and we'll still be here as well. But we're not opposed and we're not fighting against pastoralists. We've always been hand in hand. And that's the way it's going to stay for a long while into the future. Now, some people might get a bit frightened and all that, especially when native title was first introduced, but we're still going to be around. And look, I believe traditional owners stand alongside all groups that are being affected by this new proposal. And for this to be a fair and equitable decision, they must be involved in the decision-making process. And it's not too much to ask, really. It should have been done from the start. And I believe a lot of you would actually believe the same thing as what I'm seeing, that this is a modern time. People have got to change with this. And we will continue to support you. So,
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you.
Appreciate your viewpoint.
no worries.
Let's go on to Patrick O'Connor now.
How's that? Thank you. I'd like to also acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Kaurna people. As Lee said, I'm a conservation psychologist who sort of found my way into economics. What that means, I suppose, is that I'm interested in how people behave around the preservation of natural resources, both for provisioning, so the agricultural benefits from something like the pastoral lands, but also how we get conservation benefits and how we sustain in the long term. Pastoralism and conservation are coexist in a compromise. There is always an incentive to push the land a bit at this time because there is a gain. Cattle prices are high, interest rates are low, whatever the objective is. There's also always a pushback that conservation of those resources requires a very long perspective, that short-term hard hitting of the country leads to very long, slow recovery from degradation, and sometimes shifts states so that we can't recover from a state that we've reached. So pastoralism and conservation coexist, and they coexist in a compromise that's set by the South Australian community. So the South Australian community owns that land. We lease it to people to make a living, to a mixture of family producers and corporations to make use of that land to provide some economic returns to the state. The economic returns are fairly modest in total terms, in terms of what the state actually contributes to the pastoral lands relative to what the pastoral lands return in economic benefits. However, we compromise about that because people on the lands are necessary for the management of the full range of threats to conservation. So we actually want to have managers on land, on country. We want to have traditional owners having input to that. And so there's a compromise there about how we manage pastoralism and conservation. The reason that I'm pleased that the Act has been opened is that the compromise needs to be reviewed every now and then. It has to be reviewed in terms of what South Australians expect from their assets. And so the pastoral leases are let to people under conditions that are set by what will motivate behaviours to achieve the best outcomes, productively and environmentally. It actually turns out the 42-year, 14-year renewal lease arrangements that are in the Act, they're not by accident. You can't just increase it thinking that it's going to make a change for the positive of behaviours. It will not lead to long-term sustainable outcomes by increasing tenures. The investment horizon at the end of a 14-year period in a lease leads you to consider what your cash flow will be in 25 to 30 years, because that's the time at which you count your cash flow as being worth almost nothing to you today, whatever that cash flow will be in the future. And that's actually how the carbon farming system is worked up. You actually get paid for 25 years and nothing for the next 75 years if you take a 100-year lease. If you lease your carbon out to the government for 100 years, you only get paid for 25, because they know that you will discount any cash flows that return after 25 years. And that's exactly the same in pastoralism. Investments now pay off within 25 to 30 years, or you don't make them. If we stretch those pastoral leases, so what happens is you approach your 14 years, the state assesses your property, you're a good manager because you know that if you fail an assessment, you run the risk of any future investments being lost or you not getting the full return on those investments within the time left on your lease. They're not arbitrary numbers. They can't be shifted around to make people feel like they're going to get a longer return or somehow there'll be an ultimate succession result. We're opening up the Act now because social norms have changed. Usually when I talk about ecology, I would look back to studies. I don't even have to do that now. I can look in the newspaper or the radio, listen to the radio or look at the TV every day, and the stories explain to us the drastic decline in conservation values in the world, in Australia and in South Australia. And the changes to the Act will drive those that degradation even faster. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick O'Connor. Michael Mcbride, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Good evening. There'll be a slight overlap naturally between us of the process broadly that we're talking about. And I'd just like to mention that the Pastoral Act in South Australia is a little unique, partly because of the work done in the period of Dr. Bob Lange, who set about to this whole assessment process rather than just us looking at land and saying what's what. Just as we measure meat, we measure wool as producers, so we measure the land thanks to their efforts in the 80s. And this process was peer reviewed by CSIRO in Alice Springs. This then provides clear scientific evidence for anyone who wants to follow it along that the land is being used sustainably, and whilst there will be ups and downs in terms of the recent drought we've had, and of course you go back into the 50s with the rabbits where the land was just virtually decimated, but the land has come back, and one of the things with pastoral lands. But all of this means that with the 14-year review, and that there is comfort that the land is being used sustainably. If not, well, that lease isn't renewed, or that from that 14-year period. So the pastoral lands, the land side of the deal, I think is pretty well organised to work so that the land will stay in good nick. The part I see as a problem at the moment is the commercial side. As you know, with any of these requirements after the 14-year period, the Act just says there'll be discussions with the lessee, but it doesn't say when. And there's been expressed tonight, that a number of lessees have, particularly last year in drought, and of course with financial organisations breathing down their neck, there was a lot of concern for them, which needn't have happened had the Act been worked through properly on the commercial side. In other words, the pastoral section and the pastoral board making sure that the Act is implemented as it is written. And so this was one of the reasons that I believe upset a number of the lessees. There's also items like permits to extend the numbers. Given extreme seasons, wet as well as dry, wet they'd be reduced, rather they'd be increased to take advantage of short-term gain. And I'm talking here particularly in terms of the river systems, the Cooper and the Diamantina. And so lessees have an opportunity to open up their lease sum to take advantage of this flush that comes through. It's just like a big irrigation patch that won't necessarily remain once it dries off. It's a grass that just disappears. So, and then I've found that a number of lessees have had problems getting these extensions at the time when the season is there to support it. Obviously, when the season's not there to support it, they have to reduce their numbers right down to perhaps zero.
30 seconds.
Gee, that went
30,
quickly.
about 30 seconds, Michael.
I'll have to speak fastly. So I think tourism is one bit that I think with the leases now and with all the vehicles that we all have and the time we have, there's a lot of people want to look in the country. And so there's work there that has to be done. And here I'm concerned that a number of leases have been bought up for conservation purposes and shut up. So Bonbon, Bulkamata, Bimbari, Witchelina, Calamurina, people can't go onto these leases, and I think this is something that has to be looked at, because as time goes on, we will want to visit these
I'll have to
areas.
wind you up there, I'm afraid, Michael. We're
And,
out of time,
thank
but thank you, sir. We'll get back to you with some other questions in a minute. Trevor Wright.
Oh, hi, how you going? I'm here tonight to talk about tourism and the pastoral industry. I think what we've seen with tourism in the last few years, or the last couple of decades, it's become a major economic driver out there, and it's also had a huge increase in employment. And I'll go into a little bit further where I see it going. And it's coming up towards pastoralism. It's not there, or it's close to it, and it's going to continue to grow for obvious reason with the COVID situation. At the moment, with the Act, tourism hasn't been recognised, or very barely recognised, and the reason for that is I think the growth hasn't been so great when they first originated with the Act, and now it's starting to really take off. And because of COVID, the predictions are in the airline industry that it's going to take 7 years to get back to post-COVID-19, post-19 with the numbers and that. So we've basically got a captive audience for the next, I would say 5 years would be pretty much like it. You just look at Qantas. And therefore, we're going to see a lot more people coming out into the rangelands. They're going to be requiring a lot more facilities out there just to sustain a basic level. And from that, we're going to see that there will be increased revenue out of it and increased direct employment. The other problems that we're going to have with it is the public access roads out there. There's going to be a lot more people using the roads than that. And I think the pastoralists are going to have a problem at the same time, and with the environment with these roads, unless they're kept up to scratch and they're brought in as part of the whole system. One of the good things that is happening with it, and we talk about the pastoralists out there, quite a large number of pastoralists have now taken tourism on board as a secondary income source, and even in some cases you can see it as their primary income source. So they're getting a situation where there's that relationship, and it's also good from them from the point of view that they can use it from a public relations point of view as well. And to give you an idea where we are with it, 50 members of the Flinders Ranges Tour Operators Association are actively conducting business in the pastoral leases in the Flinders Ranges, and at least 31 pastoral properties provide tourist accommodation and increased and campgrounds, etc. And this has increased in the last 10 years. It's going to continue to grow. I think we need to have a voice within the industry and going forward, because it's not going to go away. It's going to continue to grow in that sense. And to give you an idea, and we'll just use Lake Eyre and the associated pastoral properties there. In 2019, and I can only talk from the point of view of aviation, we flew 26,000 people over that lake. So it says there's a real demand out there. It's really how we manage it, and it comes back to what we're talking about now. And what I can say is, if it's managed properly, the degradation is decreased and there's ownership on both sides. And that's what we've got to do going forward. We've got to do it as a win-win situation for all the parties that are involved in it, to get an outcome for all the stakeholders. And it's going to take a while to get through that. That's my opinion at this stage. But all I can say is, from the pastoral industry point of view, that it's going to be a very interesting time, and to get into tourism at the moment, I think it'll be a plus, because we've got such a captive audience out there. And I think South Australia, and this is just a byline to the whole thing, is in a unique position, because if you look at it, and this is just taking things into account, Western Australia is first to close, last to open. The Northern Territory and South Australia are the closest to the eastern states, which means the instability that's out there in the market at the moment, at least people can get home back to their own states of South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. So going forward, I really do think that tourism needs to come on board and be part of this whole project.
Thank you, Trevor. You've had 30 seconds to spare, so you've done very well. You're the star of the class. Greg Chase.
Good evening, everyone. I'm the president of Four Wheel Drive South Australia. Four Wheel Drive South Australia represents the interests of more than 40 state-based four-wheel drive clubs. These clubs are not-for-profit organisations that significantly enrich their local community. Club membership is normally family-based, and the clubs provide a way for people to come together and undertake a variety of four-wheel drive and outback-related activities. Four Wheel Drive SA has in principle objections to the proposed new legislation. In particular, we're very concerned about the extension of leases to a 100-year term. This is almost a transfer of ownership. We're also worried about the significant reduction in the diversity of the board. It is no longer a board that has a balance of different community views. Of course, the main focus for our members is continued access to public lands, especially in the form of public access routes, or as we commonly say, PARs. We are concerned about the reduction in the rights relating to PARs, especially the broad ability under the proposed Act to close a PAR without a public consultation process. There are other changes that on the surface may appear small, but the devil is in the detail. As an example, I'm unaware of any serious concern regarding camping along PARs, yet the new legislation significantly reduces the current rights around where and how long people may camp. It removes the right to camp along the PAR and requires camping on adjacent pastoral land after obtaining approval of the lessee. In many cases, the mere task of locating the lessee would be a significant challenge. It's clearly not a practical approach. It's interesting to note that many outback enterprises are now including tourism as an increasing source of alternate income. This is a good thing. It provides interesting opportunities for tourists and a significant diversification for the enterprise. However, this is critically dependent on creating and retaining a positive experience for the tourist, otherwise they won't come back. To encourage people to have longer on-farm stays, there needs to be interesting activities in the surrounding area. The public access routes provide a low-cost way of allowing visitors to see and explore many very interesting parts of our state. Rather than creating restrictions to the existing provisions, we should be considering ways to make it easier to enhance our collection of PARs. I note the proposed bill does allow for new PARs, but it removes the requirement to consult with any group other than the pastoralists affected. There is no other consultation in the proposed Act. I doubt that any new PARs will get up under this new arrangement. Finally, I note that even the title of the legislation, Pastoral Lands Bill, conveys a very restrictive message. It seeks to disenfranchise other uses of the Crown land. Consider the different message something like the Rangeland Management Act conveys to the way people perceive it. Four Wheel Drive SA does not see the need for the wholesale replacement of the existing legislation. Rather, it considers that individual concerns should be constructively worked on, and we remain willing and able to be a part of that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Greg. So that sets the scene for us this evening, and I think it gives you a bit of an indication of some of the different viewpoints that there are around this proposed new Act. So let's now try and unpack some of these issues that have been raised. And look, Joe, I'm going to go straight to you on this one because this has come up repeatedly, and that is the length of lease and why this is such an issue. And I think people are grappling to understand why there is a need to go out to 100 years. I mean, what is the business case?
Well, I think the business case...
We might hand around those handhelds, I think.
I am on.
Yep.
I'll just talk to this thing.
Right.
The business case is just long-term surety. They feel they need that longer-term surety, whether it's the climate change opportunities that come up, like carbon farming, things like that, but also for family and business planning, for succession planning. There's a real need. Well, the pastoralists tell us there's a real need to have that longer-term surety when they're talking to the banks, when they're doing all of their financial planning. I guess one of the things we've got to be aware is there are other jurisdictions in in Australia that have already lengthened their length of tenure on, there's perpetual leases and longer term leases in other jurisdictions. So it's not without precedent. So we need to understand that. This is not 100 years, see you later, we'll shut the gate and we'll go back to Adelaide and we'll come back in 100 years to assess your property. It's actually increasing the assessment process to once every 10 years instead of 14, which is now dribbling out to 20 years because of lack of resources. But given the new monitoring system that we're told is coming, we haven't got confidence in it yet, but I'm sure with technology we see the massive improvement in technology and things that just on our own farms that we see. You've got to have confidence that in time we'll have a really great system, be able to monitor our rangelands far better than we can, look at the ground cover, look at all of the ecology, and really have a good set. And if we find there is issues, then it'll be a matter of the pastoral unit going up and saying, well, what's going on here? Is it overstocking? Is it, are there other factors at play? How do we actually ensure that pastoral lease is maintained in the best condition? Pastoralists on the whole maintain their properties in the best conditions they can. That's the only way they can be profitable. So we've just got to understand 100 years is not a shut and forget. It's actually enhancing their ability to actually make a living, but also, as I said, the ongoing monitoring will be enhanced as well. So,
Patrick O'Connor, you're the economist in the group here. What do you think of the business case and for this sort of length of lease?
I more or less said it before. The settings as they are now motivate good management. There's no incentive to poor management because you won't get renewed. When you stretch to 100 years, at the end of the 14 years, if you have problems in renewal, that's still, 86 years away. So unless you do something so offensive that you could have the lease resumed, which is very rarely at stake, lengthening the lease pushes the pastoral outcomes as the priority over the conservation values and all the other values that are at play in what is the changing norms in South Australia. The Indigenous traditional owner rights, tourism opportunities, all of these things get pushed aside for production values that are dubious at best.
Right of reply, Joe?
I've lost my train of thought now. No, actually, I understand where Patrick's coming from to a degree, but we've actually got to recognise this. If we can get this really state-of-the-art monitoring system up and running, it will actually have you'll get better information as far as the ecology of the pastoral lease.
It only helps if you can if you can constrain the interest in investing for the long term.
Every 10 years, the opportunity to actually look at that lease, and if it's degrading, then they can take remedial action. And they're actually, compared to the old Act, which only had, yes, you're in, or no, you're off the lease, which was, as you highlighted, was never done.
But you were not taken off the lease at 14 years. You were still given the rest to run. So you had an incentive.
I think that's not the case now. I think it's going to be a 10-year. If you've got problems, there's significant fines put into this new legislation. So I think there's some checks and balances in there that I'm told by the pastoralists will work.
The proposed Act, Joe, is trying to cover up for the state not having resourced proper management of what was a good regime.
And that was the question I was going to ask you, Michael Mcbride, because I'm trying to read between the lines here a little bit, and I think you touched on this in what you said. I mean, is the current issue at the moment the whole trigger point for wanting a new Pastoral Act because the state government has not put in appropriate resources, that the assessment process has been bogged down, and that is actually the issue?
Exactly. And that's why, as I mentioned, that this has led to unhappiness in the pastoral community. And so it needs to be resourced, because any act is only as good as the work that's put into putting that act in place. You might be surprised that the Western Lands Act in New South Wales is a very strong act, but they don't police it. And so you've got the results there where the land is not as good as ours, put it that way. So no, it has to be resourced.
Hmm. Joshua, I was, I guess, disappointed in a way to hear your reaction, because it was kind of, for me, one of those, you know, we've done it again moments. You're feeling, I think, at the very least, aggrieved that you haven't been consulted. Can I ask you, when did you first become aware that this was actually going on? When did you first hear about it?
Very recently, actually. Yeah, very recently.
So this is after the public consultation period has come and
Yes,
gone.
yes.
You didn't know
Unfortunately,
before?
No, and it wasn't that much of a media awareness to it all. It was actually rather hidden and pushed forward. Whereas, you know, you believe in this time and age that traditional owners would have been involved from the start. And if anything, we would have been on the decision-making process in all this.
So the horse has bolted, so to speak. What do you think you can do now to catch up? Can you catch up?
Well, that's a hope at the moment. But you know, with all this happening in such a long process, over a century of this act being put forward, that were we even considered in the first place? That's the unfortunate thing. That's the disappointing thing, really. No,
yeah,
we should have been consulted from the first place and been involved in the whole decision-making process, really. So, to me, I'm rather disappointed, to tell you the truth.
And understandably, I'd suggest.
Yes.
Susan Close, what do you make of that? I mean, where is the responsibility in process when it comes to these sorts of things? I mean, is it not outrageous that a major stakeholder group had no knowledge of this proposed act until the public consultation period was over? What do you make of that?
Well, it is extraordinary because it goes against what is now common practice. So that ought to be standard. And it ought to be a matter of having your list of stakeholders and making sure that the First Nations people are on them when it comes to anything to do with land, and frequently anything to do with most government policy. And that ought to have simply happened. It makes me worry about where this has come from. So, as I say, we haven't formed a final view. We've just got a series of questions. We really want to take the pastoralist interest into account, and I know that Joe's met with the Shadow Minister, Claire Scriven, who's also at the awards tonight, because we want to understand fully what needs to happen to make sure that they are, the concerns that they have about current practice are taken very seriously. But at the same time, in the last 30 years, surely we've understood that we no longer subscribe to terra nullius, that the First Nations people are the First Nations, and we now understand that all land must be spoken about in the context of Aboriginal connection to it. So it worries me that a bill's come forward that has no stocking rates, that has a 100-year lease proposition, that doesn't have Aboriginal people being involved, let alone reflected in the legislation. All of those are red flags for me about the intent of this. And by that I mean no disrespect to the pastoralists. After all, it's not their bill. It's the government's bill.
Yes.
They have put their views forward, and some of what they would like to see, no doubt, is in there, and some isn't. So by no means this is a criticism of the pastoralists. This is a criticism of the government in its process, and therefore what has informed this bill that has now come out as a draft bill. My hope is, I mean, David Basham's a lovely man, and he was on the Natural Resources Committee with me in the last couple of years, so I got to know him a little. And my hope is that all of this is going into a better process now. That's what I would expect, that there'd be a recognition that this hasn't gone well, that it hasn't started in the right place and it hasn't started with the right process, and that now there will be a reconsideration and we might have an improved version that takes account of everybody's understanding of how the rangelands can best be managed in today's day and age.
And I want to take you up on a point there. I absolutely agree. You know, David Basham is a lovely man. No, I've known him for years in multiple guises, and he's always been a very reasonable fellow. So we're not trying to vilify anybody in this
No.
process tonight. We're trying to have a constructive conversation here. But at the end of the day, this is a public meeting, Susan Close, that clearly has been completely subscribed. People are watching a live stream of it tonight. My sense is there is growing public interest in all of this, and people are flat out playing catch up. Is it extraordinary in a democracy, in a democratic process, that there is nobody from the South Australian government who can be here tonight to participate?
I didn't realise there wasn't going to be anyone. I saw the flyer. It says SA Government. I wasn't sure whether I was speaking.
We tried pretty hard to get them here, let me tell you.
And I wasn't sure if I was speaking because I didn't know whether I was one of the groups, so I checked with you, am I on this side or that side? But I absolutely assumed that the minister or the minister's representative. Now, there are, 14 members.
I mean, he's got a valid excuse, but
he absolutely does.
Surely someone else could have come.
So David Spears, pastoral lands were managed out of the Environment Department. So this was a government choice to flip it over to primary industries, but presumably the Environment Minister has been around the table in Cabinet when they've talked about this draft bill. So I don't know. Yes, the government ought to be here. We're here, you are all here. It is a pity that the organisation that has put this forward isn't here, which means that poor Joe is sort of in that role, and it's not his role to be.
Absolutely, and we don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable here tonight. That is not the purpose of this conversation, but it's a telling point. Trevor Wright, I mean, we were talking about the Indigenous side of things being left out of the equation until very, very recently. What's the story for tourism?
Well, I think tourism's a growing industry, and probably if you go back years when the first Act was regulated, it wasn't the predominant it is now. I think it will continue to grow. We're one of the major stakeholders, as well as traditional elders and everyone else out there. And I think you've got to look at the positive side of it, what you actually bring to the table as well, because you can see there's a huge amount of the pastoral industry now taking on board the tourism venture with a different line of cash flow involved in it. So, and it's just got to be sustainable tourism at the same time. It's really important. So I'm really optimistic that if we've got all the stakeholders and we get an outcome that's that everyone's in agreement with, we're not going to have everyone agree to the total, but at least then it might provide opportunities for jobs. It'll provide opportunities for growth, etc. And yeah, I can't say it enough. I think the rangelands of South Australia are totally unique. And if we can go forward with it as a joint venture with everybody, I think it's a win-win situation. And that's what I see with tourism. I see with the pastoral industry, the traditional owners, the environmentalists, the whole lot. At the end of the day, we are there to keep the country, and I'm sure the pastoralists want to do that. I'm sure tourism wants to do it. The environment, the traditional owners, we've all got a piece of this pie together.
But can I take you back to the point? Are you happy with the level of engagement for tourism at the moment?
Well, I think we're going to get a level of engagement. It's going to come. This is a start of it as we go through it. And talking to Joe up there as well, he wants to bring us on board. The traditional, we're just refocusing or redirecting the whole thing, and it won't hurt to get that input. It's moving forward, and what the outcomes are is what it's all about.
Greg Chase, I was really interested to hear some of your comments, and you said, did you not, that effectively there's nothing wrong with the current Act in the view of the four-wheel drive fraternity in South Australia. Now, why are you saying that, and why are you worried about the new one?
I guess I don't see any particular issues with the Act, and I like incremental change rather than wholesale change. When you have an incremental change to an Act, you get to understand where you are and where you're heading to and the delta you apply to it. This is a wholesale change, and it's very hard to see where we were and what the new Act will do. Parts of the Act are very poorly worded, so you have to read between the lines and try and understand what's meant. Whereas if you take an existing clause and tweak it because there's something wrong, it's pretty easy to write an explanatory note saying why you did it. So that's the fundamental for our concern. And of course, Our view is that 42 years is already a very long period of time. It's a generational period of time. So it's an adequate, most businesses can work within that sort of time frame. In fact, they work within shorter time frames. And we also think there's a massive tourism opportunity that's being lost. It's something our members would like to do, but I note that four-wheel drive style vehicles are the major selling type of vehicle sold in Australia, and people are able to go and have an outback experience safely, effectively, and really enjoy what it is to be Australian. And I think we're missing a big opportunity not to make more noise about that.
Patrick O'Connor, I'm really interested to ask you about conservation, because my mail is that the conservation movement is split right down the middle on this issue, that it comes down to, and correct me if I'm wrong when you get to answer, but what I've heard is that big conservation, the conservancies, foundations like Pew, etc., who own pastoral leases currently and do what they do, and arguably doing it very well, not questioning that, but they are coming from one direction. There are a pile of people in the conservation sector or interest area that are coming from a very different direction. Is that true? And is that why the Conservation Council is not represented here tonight?
No, the conservation movement comes at it all from the same direction. So the outcome that's being desired here is broad scale conservation. The conservancies who own pastoral leases have an interest that is the broad scale conservation and the particulars of leases. So there can be differences in about how you achieve the balance between those two things that you have to choose between. But the conservancies on the broad South Australian-based conservation movement is well aware that the degradation of the rangelands occurring from the current settings, will get worse. The broad group of conservation organisations want to see that change. Part of that is locking up some areas under conservation rather than pastoralism. That's part of that balance, that some areas need to be set aside. The Bulkamata that was mentioned has the plains wanderer. It's a threatened bird. It hides where there's foliage. It lives by camouflage. It runs away rather than flies away. You eat it down, it loses its habitat, it goes extinct. And that's its trajectory. The data came out yesterday that South Australia's threatened bird species are at 83% of where they were in 1985. So we can't pretend that we are managing the land well, and so all conservation organisations understand that, but there are multiple layers of objective in that.
And I guess there are different viewpoints on that too, obviously between a conservation perspective and maybe a commercial agricultural perspective. Michael Mcbride, I want to bring you in here because you were expressing some concern about big conservation who hold some of these leases. Am I right in sensing that you're saying effectively they're really locking people out as well, and that is not a good thing?
Exactly. In a time when tourism is taking off, we've only got to go past the school to see how many four-wheel drives there are parked out the front. But more particularly with places like Bulkamata, they were assessed earlier, and so there are points there that are GPSed, and I think it'd be an interesting study to go back onto those points and just see what the land says now, because we did try this at one stage with the National Parks request up in the Flinders Ranges, and the report came back that it was seriously degraded. I went in to have a look. This was near Orapurina in the Flinders Ranges Park, and it was. You couldn't fit a 20-cent piece between lumps of kangaroo manure. So with it all locked up, in fact, the animal pressure there was greater than any pastoralist would put on it. And under the readings of the system devised by Bob Lange, it showed up. And so then I believe all land has to be managed, because we've altered it no matter what. We've dingoes, for one, don't run everywhere. And of course, we've put in waters for livestock, and of course that makes that other animals can run rampant over others. And so all land has to be managed, including conservation land, I believe. And it would be an interesting test just to see, because it was a system that was put in after a lot of work, a lot of experimentation, as I said, peer-reviewed by CSIRO Alice Springs.
Greg Chase, I imagine some of these areas that are currently under the stewardship of big conservation, if I can put it that way, would potentially be very attractive to your members. Now, some of them, I know, do let you in, but others effectively don't. What's your feeling about that? And is that something you'd like to see changed in new legislation?
Yeah, I guess I make the point that a route through an area is quite a small amount of the landscape. They're not particularly wide, and in terms of very large tracts of lands, the impact of a road obviously changes the environment in that area, but it's a very small and localised impact. It still allows people to access and experience the areas. I struggle to see the value of a totally locked up area that no one can get into, because it's sort of like if you can't see it and can't go there, then it doesn't exist.
Susan Close, I want to pick up on something the Minister said in his video earlier, and I'm wondering, it's carbon farming. He was talking about leases in terms of things like carbon farming can't happen in the rangelands if you don't have a 100-year lease. Is this a red herring?
Well, as I understand it, yes.
Yes.
So a couple of things, and I think we have other people here who are probably better qualified than I am, but as I understand it, there are a couple of issues. One is that carbon farming occurs over a 25-year lease anyway, not a 100-year lease. And another is that it goes on to the title which is held by government. So that won't change. Government owns this land. We are not freeholding the land, despite the proximity between a 100-year lease and a freehold. It isn't. It is owned by government. So I don't understand why this is being used. I've also seen a letter from SACOM, the mining industry body, which is very concerned about this bill, this draft bill, and cites that as one of the concerns they have, because they are worried that if there is a move to have conservation land not managed under the Act, that becomes harder for them to have the relationship where they can have the carbon offsets with conservation managed land that the mining industry uses as part of its sustainability. So it doesn't seem like there's a lot of friends for this bill, other than some elements of it, which obviously the pastoralists are keen on, but not all of it. But I'm not sure if you want to say any more about the
Patrick,
concerns
what
about
you
carbon farming.
I don't know who advises the Minister, but if you type into Google, carbon farming Australia, how long, it will tell you can take a contract for 25 years with the Australian government, right? So the Minister may need new advisors. The reason that you can take a contract, and you can have a 100-year contract, but you only get paid for the first 25 years of carbon. The other carbon is your problem for 75 years, but whether you can sell it or not, because it'll be a relatively small amount, is another issue. So the long term of having carbon for 100 years is actually probably bad for conservation. The other thing is that the reason that you can have a carbon farming contract is that pastoralism has increased the emissions of carbon through the soil disturbance, grazing regimes, the conversion of carbon in sugars into methane, which is a more radiatively active gas. So when you want to increase pastoralism, you increase emissions. So to take a contract is essentially to re-sequester the carbon that has been emitted from past action. If you increase pastoral productivity, we will emit more. If we then have another property that we have a 25-year lease on the carbon, at the end of which you can change back to pastoralism and release it again, there's nothing wrong with leasing the carbon, but it doesn't make sense to lease the land to somebody so they can lease you the carbon back. Right? The system is that we all want the carbon sequestered, not individuals want it. We all benefit from that. Every unit that gets sequestered, we will benefit from. So leasing out land so you can lease back carbon doesn't make sense.
My head is hurting. Joshua Haynes, from a traditional owner's perspective, let's look to the future. What would you like to see that would be an improvement from your perspective, from a traditional owner's perspective, that you'd like to see enshrined in a new act?
Well, there has to be more of a collaborative effort between all groups when it comes to traditional owners having an input and having more of a say in this. I mean, when you mentioned some of the bird species and that, there's some of our spiritual animals. We've got this connection. The animals and to the Australia itself. We want to see it protected over a longer term. And that's what's really important, is seeing Australia progress into the future and still stay the same as well. You know, for our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids into the future. It's a looking forward sort of vision. We look back to the past, but we've got to look forward to the future. And in one way, we've got to work with the tourism and the four-wheel drive industry and provide them a safe and, you know, a great experience of South Australia's outback. And that's what we're trying to look towards. It's got to be a true collaborative effort, as I said.
Michael Mcbride, you have such an incredible corporate memory when it comes to the current Pastoral Act. You have been intimately involved with it pretty much at all levels, and you must know the legislation inside out. Is it broken? Do we need a new one?
I agree with the four-wheel drive group. I think it's far better to move incrementally rather than major changes. But when you can see a problem, legislation or no, you've got to work out, is it the legislation or is it the implementation of the legislation? And that's the big thing I think we've got to work on in this case.
One of the other things that the Minister said is that these reforms are, if I can quote him, intended to provide stronger conservation of the rangelands and easier ability to undertake alternative activities. Now, can I just ask you collectively what you think about that? Do you see that potential in this new Act? Susan Close, what do you think?
Well, I don't think so, because we have this thing called estimates in Parliament, which is when you ask questions about the budget. So the Minister comes with the Minister's advisors, and it's much more informal. You don't have to stand up, and you can ask sort of more of a conversational series of questions. So it can be really useful. One of the features of it is that the upper house members of Parliament don't participate. So I was being Claire Scriven, who is the Shadow Minister for Primary Industries, and asking questions. And so I asked some questions about this. And I had the sense that the Minister, who was then even more new at the time, he really had only been Minister for a few weeks, had been given some lines to read about this, but was not overly familiar. So that was one of the lines he gave, that this would be, you know, good for multiple uses, but at the same time seemed to be clear that if you manage the land for conservation purposes, then you'd be kicked out of. But I don't know how you can be kicked out of the rangelands. So you're still in the rangelands, but you're not covered by this Act. So what are you covered by? It seemed to me that the Minister hadn't been fully appraised of all of the dimensions of the Act. And that concerned me. And at that point, I don't think he understood that significant parts of the conservation movement were pretty opposed to this and had given me questions to ask. And so I felt that would happen, and indeed they have had meetings subsequently. But it seems to me that's another reason to think that maybe this process hasn't gone probably quite as smoothly as governments like that. I worked in government and I've been a minister and I'm now in opposition, so I get it. I've been part of things not going smoothly, I'm sure. So I don't mean to be overly critical, but I think this probably hasn't flowed in the way that one might expect. Possibly change of minister enables a bit of an opportunity to rethink it. And one of the questions I think that's fundamental is what role do the traditional owners have? Another question is recognising that there are multiple uses. There's tourism, there's version of tourism being enjoying the land through camping and through four-wheel driving. There's productive use, there's traditional and cultural uses, and there's absolutely without the environment you don't have the rangelands, it's just a bit of dust, then how do we bring all of that together in a way that works? And there was a Royal Commission many years ago that landed with this version of that. I don't know that we need another Royal Commission, but let's at least start from where that Royal Commission left it, which is that there are many uses and all of them need to be satisfied, not one. And my plea to the government, I guess, would be, are you sure that you're right about this? Are you sure this is what you want to bring to Parliament? Would you perhaps like to go back and rethink how we can bring all of these better together? And then we might have a piece of legislation that we can all get around.
Patrick, I think you were wanting to come in there, were you?
Well, in no future world will further mammal and bird extinctions in South Australia be a good result. And this proposed act is so far from community expectations. It's so far from the consultation already done before this draft was written. This is an ideological strike. It's got nothing to do with conservation. The minister's saying it's about conservation. I mean, ministers don't say we're doing this because it'll be bad for conservation, but there is nothing in the act that will in any way protect the existing state or improve it, which is where we have to go. It is all downhill from here. So full force against the proposed act, back to the old act, fix up some of those things that are going to make a broader coalition of the actual interest of South Australians.
Now, I'm very keen to open it up to the floor now because I'm sure we've unpacked a whole bunch of issues already. There are more, I know, and there may be more things that you want to drill down into. There are hands everywhere immediately. So, Jock, if I can ask you to go to this lady firstly down here. We'll get a second microphone so we can go up the other side. If you could say who you are and where you're from, we'll get up to the back very, very shortly. First question down here.
Thank you. I'm Kay Fields. I'm a pastoralist from the northern areas of South Australia. I'm just amazed actually at some of the things that have come out of today's meeting. We've been involved in pastoralism for over 100 years, my family has, and we've been involved with tourism for 52 years. Now, as Michael Mcbride said before about management, that is the key to managing the rangelands of South Australia. If you haven't got good managers in there, if you haven't got good infrastructure and you haven't got good practices in place to control your animals, your people, you know, to be able to foresee when there's a dry time to get your stock off, which we now have the luxury of being able to do, which we couldn't do 50 years ago. You had to drove them everywhere. And I'm, you know, to hear the conservation side of this, we are conservationists. We've always been conservationists. We want our land to be there for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And to hear people here almost as though every pastoralist is out there, is just out there to ruin the land. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, you might get corporates that come in, don't understand the land. You might get someone new come in. And I think going to your 10-year assessments is so much better. And using your satellite imagery, all of that sort of thing, you've got more control over how that land is assessed, whereas before it was all done, you know, on ground, and it wasn't terribly effective. And, you know, sometimes the 14-year assessments went to 16 years or whatever. And I feel having this new way of assessing the land is going to be so much better. I'm not saying there's not flaws in the Act, but I think everyone needs to be sensible about this. That's people's livelihoods that you are dealing with. It's not just, we're not just out there to make money. We're out there, it's our life. We've been out there when tourism was very new. We've always made sure that the tourists kept to the tracks. If anyone went off the tracks, they were severely dealt with. And you have to do that. If out in that country, you can't just go and make because you've got a whoopie-doo four-wheel drive and Mickey Thompson tyres, you can't just go wherever you want to go. You have to stay on the tracks, and that's what we, you know, we really trying to police that. It's not easy, especially with self-drive, four-wheel drive tracks. And you would be amazed. And some of the people who think that they're the biggest conservationists are the worst offenders. And I, you know, I really feel that I need to stand up for the people who've lived in the outback, who understand the land, And I'm not saying there's not some that don't, but the majority of people out there are family people who want that land to be there for the next generations to come.
Thank you. I'll take that as a comment and really do take on those points. And I understand what you're saying, because in all of my years and my love of the outback and getting to know so many pastoralists, yes, the vast majority of them love the land and want to do the best by it. Personally, I don't think that's in question. Now, where's our next question? Jock, over here. And then if we can go up the back, I think we've got several questions up the back. Yes.
My name's Harold Eamon, wildlife ecologist, now retired, and I spend a lot of time at Arkarawla working with Undul, which are yellow-footed rock wallabies. Where I come from, my belief is that this life is about cooperation between the pastoralists, between conservation, between government. We've also got a situation here, we've got to think about power and power imbalances. And there are power imbalances on all sides, let's get it right. And we've got to try and reduce them, because it's power imbalances that causes the problems. So the next point is that government have an obligation to protect us. That is their duty. That is why we have governments, to protect us. Now that extends to the environment, because if the environment is not protected, we are all cactus. That's the bottom line. So that needs to be borne in mind. The original Australians have been ignored up to now in this process. I find that is quite shameful. It's wrong. This process at the moment is premature. It needs to go back to the drawing board.
Thank you. Now, Bradley, you up the top there? Can you take a microphone over here to this gentleman with the hat? Yeah, just behind you, there's the mic.
Firstly, can you hear me down there?
Yep.
Not very loud up here. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands and where we meet tonight. I can certainly appreciate their cultural and spiritual connection to this land. I have very strong cultural and spiritual connection to my country. I've got a question to ask, but I also got a little statement to make.
Sure.
My name is Vince Coulthard. I'm an Adjumantna person from the Flinders Ranges region of South Australia. I am absolutely disgusted to hear what's been happening about the lands, our traditional lands. I hear tonight, 2 days ago, I heard about this bill. 2 days.
That was the first time you heard about it?
First time I heard about it, 2 days ago. That is absolutely disgusting in this day and age. I think we, First Nations people, even in this day and age, it's sad to hear that we're the last people on that come there right at the end. We were here first. No matter what part of this land you walk on, it's Aboriginal land. When the government and these people that sit down and draft up these legislations come out and talk to the traditional owners, it is absolutely disgusting. Already in the bill, I've been at a long opportunity to look at it. As I've said, it's only been 2 days. I've been caught up in doing other things, other meetings and so on. But you have taken a very important part of the bill out. That's allowing Aboriginal people, First Nation people, or traditional owners to pursue follow through with their own pursuits in land management. I mean, it's crazy. You go along, you look after the pastoralists and look at giving 100-year leases to them. What about the traditional owners? Where are we going to be able to pursue our rights. I think it's crazy.
Was there a question as well? Did you want to ask anyone a question?
That's my question is, there's a very important part of this legislation. I just only one aspect at this point in time. I want to see what the reason was in removing it. And that was to allow the pastoral board to allow Aboriginal people or the Aboriginal people to pursue their our lands. I mean, like the IPAs, for instance, where Aboriginal people can set aside lands for conservation reasons and protection. That's not catered for in this new legislation.
Thank you. And I think that the truth of it is that a lot of the problems that we have in life are because people don't communicate properly. And I'm getting this message loud and clear tonight that there hasn't been appropriate communication here, and that you know, maybe the government should have done a much better job of that. But I'll leave that there. Jock, where's the next question, please?
Hi, my name is Naomi Ray. I'm an ecologist and a teacher. I just got a little anecdote and then a question. I spent a couple of weeks doing ecological surveys up in the Coongie Lakes area about 30 years ago, and we repeated that survey a couple of years ago. 30 years ago, there was a big push by the government for multiple use of pastoral lands, and that came up against some opposition from scientists and others, but it went through, and it was absolutely astonishingly shocking, the change in the land in 30 years. I was absolutely staggered that multiple use had not achieved the objectives that the government at the time said it would. They thought that conservation and pastoralism and mining and other interests could coexist happily together. So there's I think there is a real need to address the deficiencies of the Act, because it clearly isn't, the pastoral lands to me weren't being managed in the way that I thought that they were supposed to be.
And do you have a view on where the deficiencies are?
Well, perhaps there's not been resourcing to have these assessments done properly. The question I had was the absence of the oil and gas industry. They were one of the actors or the stakeholders, I think, that had responsible for a lot of the damage, the tracks and the shot lines and the camps and the drilling and the fencing off of areas. I understand that the Mining Act trumps all the other acts, so that we have a problem there because the minerals under the earth are separate title from pastoral titles. But I just wondered if anybody had any comment or from the panel about the oil and gas industry and where they fit into the management of what somebody said. I think that would be fantastic if the Pastoral Act was actually called the Rangelands Management Act, because that does encompass everybody. Thanks.
Yes, look, I'll throw it open to others to answer, but from an organisational perspective, we actually have tried really hard to get the broadest possible cross-section of interests to be here tonight. And the other side of that is that the more you get, the more difficult it is to actually have a meaningful conversation and allow people enough time to say something. So, look, I take your point. We just we haven't been able to accommodate everybody, and maybe that is a problem tonight. Would anyone like to field this question? Patrick.
I'm not certain about the oil and gas thing, but there are big impacts from those explorations, and they do continue. Part of the reason they're probably not here is that it's a state priority for that economic activity. But back to your point about the Rangelands Management Act, you could call this proposed act the Princess Diana Memorial Act, and it would not improve it. So the fundamentals of the act are the problem. If we want a Rangelands Management Act, we have to aim for creating that. And I think there have been some very good suggestions about a more inclusive approach to that. But and that can bring the oil and gas parties into the room. But the current proposal is so offensive that you couldn't rename it and hope that it would smell any better.
Well, let's go over here, please.
Lee Allen Holmes. A bit of a history here, I guess. Lee, congratulations on the event tonight. I think it's fantastic. I think the discussion's been enormously valuable. and it presents a much more unified view than I thought it might. So that's one thing. Look, I'd like to actually ask a question of government, and I appreciate there's not a government representative here tonight to answer that, but I think it's a really important question that needs to be asked. If you look at the process that we went through to get us here, there was a discussion paper. For those that, this is the process that government went through. There was a discussion paper, there was a period of consultation, there was a summary of that consultation, and then there was a draft bill prepared. Now, the funny thing was, the draft bill bears no relationship to the discussion paper or what was found in the consultation, which is just quite extraordinary. We've ended up with a bill, and what it's done is it's put pastoralists and conservation at odds when they ought not be at odds. It's excluded whole groups of people. It hasn't thought about tourism, hasn't thought about first Australians. So it's quite extraordinary. So my rhetorical question is to the minister that isn't here, and I appreciate the reasons why he's not here, but somebody should be here, because in the end, ministers are accountable. That's what they are elected to Parliament for, to account to their electorate. So what the hell went wrong here? Why have we ended up in a situation where we're having a fight that we shouldn't be having? When you listen to this conversation, we could have constructed something here that would work for South Australians. So that's my great disappointment. And if I go back to, just to make one last point, the original act was called, the 1989 Act, I've got to get the name right because I always get it wrong. Look, it's the Pastoral Land Management and Conservation Act. It was Pastoral Land Management and Conservation. It was recognised after 3 or 4 royal commissions that you actually had to put these two things together. And that's what Michael Mcbride managed for a long period of time incredibly well. What went wrong is we pulled the resources out. It wasn't the act, we pulled the resources out. I mean, I was part of that. I'm partly responsible.
So he is right. It's the government's fault because they've pulled the plug.
Whatever reason we've allowed it, you know, it's not a Liberal Labor thing. It happened over a period of time where the resources were taken out. We couldn't meet the commitments to do the 14 years. Pastoralists got frustrated because their leases weren't renewed. God, what a mess. You know, That's the problem. The problem is with the administration, not with the law. I better shut up.
And Alan, thank you for the points you've made too. And I've got to say that again, getting back to the purpose of this discussion tonight, I mean, 2 very different organisations have come together here to actually facilitate this public opportunity. And the reason for that was to be constructive. It was never about being confrontational. And I guess in our planning of it, Alan, we were hoping that this might be in some form a bit of a circuit breaker, a pressure release. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, that time will tell. But Susan, what do you make of the rhetorical question, and can you take that back to government?
Yes, and well, sometimes in politics, there is only one choice that you can make. There are a few options and you have to choose one. But what is better in politics is if you can find a shared vision and a shared view. If we start from a confrontational perspective, we're likely to end up with more discontent and unhappiness.
I've got the sense nobody wants a fight here.
No one here wants, and you know,
someone started a fight.
You may very well say so. I couldn't possibly. But you know, to hear the pastoralists feeling that anyone up here is suggesting that current management is being done badly is heartbreaking, because the best of pastoralism is the best of conservation. They're indistinguishable, and yet this bill appears to have set off a pathway of criticism and rebuke, and that is a pity. Because what we need is to see that we are dependent on the earth prospering. That means the environment has to be healthy, and it means that people have to be able to make a living. And this act, the current act, has attempted to do that. This bill appears to take one side, and that's not the fault of the side it appears to have taken. And it is not surprising that the people who feel that their interests have not been reflected, it's not surprising that they've responded in this way. But we don't have to stay in this paradigm. We don't have to stay in this confrontation. I get a sense that there is a prospect of being able to find an incremental improvement, recognising the resource deficiencies, and as Alan's prepared to take some responsibility, I will, but on behalf of the previous Labor government. This is not an area that should be underfunded. This is it's 40% of the state. So, you know, blame where we like, that shouldn't happen and it should stop. The fact that there's a new version of how we could do this assessment is really exciting. And the fact that there's a willingness to say, well, maybe we could do that every 10 years and it will be better, that's brilliant. Let's build on that and not have a piece of legislation that seems to be pitting interest groups against each other, which in fact should be coherent. And the First Peoples teach us that. They lived here and still live here for tens of thousands of years, and the environment was intact. So how about we learn from that and find a place to be together?
We're all in this together, so perhaps you could take that message back to North Terrace. Now, next question is down here.
Hi, I wanted to ask the panel, I have recently been contrasting the Planning Development Act regime that's coming into South Australia, and it made me reflect on the fact that it made me reflect on the fact that there's a lot of emphasis on climate change impact in the planning regime. Let's not comment on whether it's effective, but its values are there. And yet in this legislation, I don't think there's a reference to climate change. And I wondered what the panel have to say about the, I don't know, integration or robustness of scientific basis for decision making going forward, given the climate change issue that is there.
Serious question. Who'd like to have a crack? Just take the microphone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg.
I'm not going to directly go on to climate change, but I just want to make a statement that multispectral remote sensing is an enormously powerful tool. It's a tool that is going to get dramatically better in the coming decades, and it has the massive opportunity to reduce cost, but to have greater compliance because you can look at a much finer level of detail. However, you don't need to change the Act to change the way that you evaluate something. And that might just be a logical progression. 10 years, 14 years is not a huge difference. And there are modern scientific tools that we should be adopting.
Michael, did you want to pick up on anything?
Just to make the point that I would imagine the assessment would pick up on that, because if the country's becoming degraded because of climate change, well then the stock numbers would need to be reduced, etc. But nonetheless, it's a factor that one of the many that we should be not have just in the back of our mind.
Any other comments before we go to the next question? Joe?
Just on the thing around climate change, I agree it's not in the Act at the moment, but you've actually got to remember that pastoralists have been working with climate variability for hundreds of years. Whilst it's increasing, they make adapt to those changing climate, and that'll continue to happen. So we've actually got to work with the pastoralists to ensure that they've got the right tools to manage their country as well as we can. I sort of take a little bit of umbrage at Patrick in saying that the pastoral country is degrading. Now, that's fine to say that, but if everybody walks off the land, the outcomes for the pastoral region is pretty dire. So I think we've actually got to support pastoralism going forward. We've got to make sure that they've got the tools to ensure that they can be profitable, but also, given Patrick's concerns, they also make sure that or understand that they've got to maintain their environmental assets.
And did you want to pick up on that, Patrick?
Thanks, Joe. So the first rule of managing under uncertainty is don't lock yourself in. So this Act is about locking things in to an old way of thinking about what the only priorities are. It's not, I don't mean that in punishing individual pastoralists or family pastoralists, but the objective here is to deal with, in climate change, is to deal with the uncertainty, the inherent uncertainty on a regular basis and even about what we know will occur. What you don't do is lock stuff up so that you can't change.
I'm shocked to hear you say that. The Minister said something very different. Now, next question is, it's right up here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Phil Radostovich is my name. I'm Treasurer of the Land Rover Register of South Australia. We're a club affiliated with the Four-Wheel Drive Association through Greg. I've travelled extensively in South Australia. I'm struggling sitting here tonight contemplating the broad agreement at the front of the room about the discontent with certain aspects of the Act, and yet 100-year leases and trying to figure out what industries would require that amount of planning. One springs to mind immediately, that's mining. Gina Reinhardt and her consortium have just bought the Gibbon Pastoral Properties a few years ago. She's a major miner. I'm wondering if there's a Trojan horse here, notwithstanding the carbon capture mentioned by the Minister.
I'm not sure we've got anyone who can really respond to that here at this stage, but I'll take that as a comment. Look, time's marching on and we're into the home straight here in terms of the time we've got left in this meeting tonight. We do have to be out of this building at a certain time. So let's go for 3 more questions at the moment. I'm keen to go over this side because there haven't been many questions from this side, but we'll take the next one from up the top.
Yeah, my name's Derek Mcbride. I'm more of a tourist in this respect, so I really appreciate what's going on there. But there's a couple of pieces that I've really picked up on here with your 14-year lease, yeah, and now wanting to make it to 100. That's a quantum leap.
It's not quite as simple as that. They're 42 years at the moment, but there is a renewal process on a 14-year basis.
Would it just something that you might be able to discuss or bring it up, perhaps make that 14-year into a 25-year, or the 42 into a 50, so that rather than go to that straight 100.
Yeah, look, I think that this is a recurring theme, and I'll take that as a comment at this stage because I'm keen to get a couple more questions over here. Noel, we'll get to you in a minute, but this gentleman on the aisle.
G'day, it's Craig Wilkins from the Conservation Council.
That's what you look like, Craig. I've been speaking to you on the telephone. I had no idea what you look like.
And congratulations, Lee. This has been a really, really useful conversation. Well done for facilitating it. There's been a really interesting discussion which raises a threshold question around revolution versus incremental change. And that's, if we can resolve the issue of resourcing, which ensures lease tenure security for that 25 years or so that's required for banks and for financial security, as Patrick's pointed out, if we can sort that out, are there any other issues that can't be sorted by fixing up the current Act rather than throwing it all out and starting again? Or, and this has been a really useful conversation, we've had commentary from Uncle Vince and for Joshua around, actually, we might need to start again with a more respectful process. So keen for the panel's thinking around, is it about reforming the current Act, or do we need to start again in order to ensure traditional owners are respected and involved in the process properly?
Okay, let's just quickly go along, starting at the end. Greg, I think your view is fairly clear.
I think my view is fairly clear that I like incremental.
Trevor?
Yeah, I'd like to see incremental change as well, but I'd like to have a really good look at the Act or where they're proposing it. As you said, it's been at short notice and you've got to know all your facts.
Michael?
I think too that we realise that there's an issue of running the show of the funds to make sure that the section works properly, because whatever's in the Act has to be implemented, and that's the important part.
I think the move to create this proposal demonstrates that going along as we were and improving on it slightly is not enough. That if this could be proposed when there's very strong evidence that this is not what was in the interests of South Australians, I think we have to pull back to what we really want. So it's not just about some incremental tweaks in the existing Act, it's a reframing of what South Australians actually want the pastoral lands, including pastoralism, to be doing into the future.
Joshua?
Yes, I'd like to build on that. There has to be some real reform in the current Act as it stands. And, moving into a current or future generations, this is the way it has to go, really.
So can we fix it by playing with the existing Act, or does it need to be a new Act? What do you think?
I believe it should stay the same Act and just be amended.
Great.
Yeah.
Susan, close?
Yeah, so I don't know that they're inconsistent. I think this has started now, right? So we can't just all pack up and go home.
Yep.
So let's do the process properly, and the process needs to take full account of everything that's happened in the last 30 years that might make us look differently at the management of the rangelands. That may result, though, in relatively minor shifts in some parts of the Act. The Act may be more significant in other parts. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a contrast between incrementalism and a proper process. But what we absolutely need to do is make sure that we have as many South Australians on board as possible.
And Joe?
The only thing I'd say is it is a draft act. I don't think the minister's, he is going through all the submissions, and it's his act, so it's up to him to what he does with it. Talk to Susan about that. But really, we've got to understand it is a draft, and I think somebody said it's poorly written in places, and I tend to agree with that. But anyway, it is a draft. He's got lots of submissions that we all made, and you know, we went out and there was some consultation process. Whether it's comprehensive enough, that's for others to judge. But certainly there was some consultation. We have all made some, or numbers of us have made lots of submissions. He's got that in his. He's considering those as he speaks. So I guess we've gone down the process for a while. So we need to actually think about, is draft number 2 going to fit the bill? So. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Joe. I get the sense that we are actually reaching a few points of conclusion here, and that's one of them. There is some homework to be done. Next question, Noel.
Thanks, Lee. Noel Richards, Royal Geographical Society, Flinders Union, sometimes friend of Warrarina Station. This is perhaps a little procedural after that excellent sort of roundup there, but how does this Act, or the existing Act for that matter, interact with other acts such as the South Australian Landscape Act of 2019, or Commonwealth Acts such as the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and how do they all interact, and does this Act, proposed Act, really accommodate that?
Wow, that's a good question. Who wants to have a crack?
I will say that I understand that it doesn't interact well with the Landscape SA Act, that there's been legal advice sought that suggests that the objects of the Landscape SA Act would not apply in the range, so not apply to 40% of the state. That troubles me deeply. Now that's remediable, of course, but it worries me how it got to that point. I don't know how it interacts with EPBC. I don't think anything can override that. Yeah, because it's a common.
Alan Holmes, I think you have the answer, do you? Or
Lee, just to give a bit of background to this, originally, if you go back 20 years, the intention was to put pastoral into the NRM Act. That was always viewed that we would step our way into integrating. So the logic would be that the Landscape Act and the Pastoral Act should fit together very, very well, as was pointed out very much earlier.
Thanks, Lee. It's Bill Nosworthy from Eyre Peninsula. I'm a pastoralist, a grazier. I think, like the pastoralists up north, I'm also a conservationist, an environmentalist, and I consider myself, like I'm sure Vince and I'm sure, Joshua, in a way we're custodians of our land as well. We have a good relationship at home with the local fellas over there and that mob, and I'm sure up north it's much the same. This evening, though, I think we've heard emotions from all different sides, but I don't think anyone's picked up on the emotions of the pastoralists themselves. They're the same as me and probably better at it. They're ecological giants in the way that they've lasted for 100, 150 years up there in that country, where we down south sit back and wonder in awe how they do it, or what seems to be more popular, we seem to be saying, we don't really want you to do that anymore, but you can do it like we say. I hope out of tonight, Lee, that we come up with something that's perhaps a little softer approach and taking a little more notice of what those in those rangelands have to go through already, with all the types of regulations that are put on them by government and natural resources and the pastoral board and the federal government. I'd like to get comments from Susan, who I congratulate her on being here tonight, and it's been a long time since we've seen you. Could you give us a bit of comment on what you understand or what you envisage the Act could be tweaked, as you like to say, to be better whilst still taking into account the pastoralists' needs, dreams, hopes and aspirations for the future?
Well, respectfully, I think that that's probably the last thing I should do, because this is not about what I think. This is about a proper process where we listen properly to the concerns with the current Act and how it can be improved. I think we've largely agreed that the process hasn't been perfect in this case, but we are still during the process, so it's not at the end yet. What is absolutely important is that pastoralism is able to continue. To be able to continue, the environment needs to be well looked after, as it is. There's some concern, I gather, that there is a distinction perhaps between people who live on the land and run the land and have had generations go back doing that, and perhaps some newer interests that have come in as corporate leaseholders, that maybe there isn't the same sensitivity. I don't know the percentage of one versus the other and whether that's shifted dramatically recently. I'd like to know that. But I think what's really important is that a politician doesn't come here and say, this is how the Act should be fixed, but says to you, what I see as the values that need to be preserved in legislation are that pastoralism continues, that the environment is well protected, that changing understanding of climate change is able to be reflected in that management, that the First Nations people's interests are reflected and respected, and that this be a piece of legislation that can last the test of time. The last thing you need is a piece of legislation that the next lot want to change immediately. So what we need is to reach an accommodation and an agreement. We've had that for 30 years. It's served South Australia well because our lands are better managed than many others interstate. But if we're going to do this again, let's do it well and let's do it together.
Now, we have to be out of here shortly. So, Jock, you've been enabling people to ask questions and to put their points of view. You get the last go.
Thank you very much, Lee. Jock Schmeishan, and I've been around the outback and that for about 40 or 50 years. I think just about in with the Diprotodon bones. And I've spent about 14 years on the Lake Eyre Basin Advisory Committee to the Pastoral Forum, representing tourism amongst other things. So my first word is to the pastors that are here, and I see many faces familiar. This is not anything against you. I think the majority of people here from every ilk will be totally in cahoots with you of how you manage those rangelands and how you're able to do it. This is about, if we're going to modernise, a new modern approach to get a more cohesive element in this Act. And we have a motion that a few of us have prepared and out of an outback interest group, which maybe captures, maybe get the blank one on the other one, which maybe captures the idea of what's said here, that whatever the process is, as Joe said, yes, it was a discussion paper, yes, there was consultation. Most people didn't know it. If you knew this, read the stock journal, or had a few ins, you knew about it. So there's a flaw in the process. I think the message that needs to go back to the Minister or his representatives is simply this, and it's been reiterated around the floor, that basically this current Act draft is just not anywhere near there. And there needs to be more people brought into the conversation. They're all sitting around that table there. It's only a small clique at the moment, behind closed doors, you know, trying to thrash this out, and they don't know enough about the broader interest. And the whole South Australian public hasn't even been fully engaged with this, and they more than likely will. So have a look at that. We don't have any great time for discussion because I think it's all been had.
Can I ask, just to be clear, can I ask you where this is a motion, yes?
Yes.
Where is it coming from? Who is putting this up? You are articulating it. Where's it coming from?
Well, it's primarily come from a group of people that are interested in the outback and have a strong affinity for it. And some of those here in the audience and have been party of this and have also helped to try and facilitate a broader discussion. So that's where it's come from. And like I said, it may or may not reflect the total view, and you don't have to accept it, but it is a message that we could send back to the Minister from this. So,
and we'll get to that. I just want to be very clear, though. That's why I asked where this is coming from. The Royal Geographical Society of South Australia and Rural Media and Communicators, SANC, are not putting any position on this. So I just want that to be abundantly clear to everybody who is here and who may be watching online. We don't really have time for discussion because we do need to wind up in the next 3 or 4 minutes.
So it's purely an issue of whether this reflects to some degree your knowledge, intent, wherever you're from, that this is a worthwhile thing to send back to the government, purely asking them to reconsider what they're doing and maybe re-engage the process a bit further. And we can just do it purely on a basis of show of hands. No, we're not going to have any, we can't have any more discussion because we're going to be...
Okay, I'll take this as a motion then. This wasn't really the intent, but we'll take this as a motion. You're the seconder. Can I have a show of hands if you are in favour of this motion, please? Okay, that's a lot of hands. Those against? Okay, so we've got 2 against, I think. Is that correct?
2 against and a considerable number of quarter abstaining.
Yes, it might be good to know who's abstaining too. Would you like to put up
If
your
you're
hand?
abstaining...
Okay, right. Good, thank you very much.
Is that good enough, Lee?
Well, yeah, that's a motion. I just, now that that's happened, I want to give a final opportunity to anybody else who wants to do anything similar. Is there anybody else who has a perspective that they would like to put to the room? Bill?
Take umbrage at the fact that something snuck up on us so late. This has gone on the board in print and could have been put up at the beginning of the meeting tonight, not at the end. I think bringing it up and saying you can't have any discussion on it, we want it yes or no. I accept that everybody stuck their hands up. I abstained. And I just asked that it be made more clear, no late in the day under the carpet stuff. That's coming from me.
Good on you, Bill. Thank you for that.
Look, I accept that, and I mean, that wasn't the intent. So I guess the question is, what's a better way to go forward to just indicate some intent out of this meeting, other than there was a pretty good comprehensive attendance and some pretty broad discussion, and it was fairly cohesive?
I think a follow-up forum would be most interesting, and perhaps this could be part of the discussion at that forum.
Okay.
I've driven 700 k's to be here for this. I'll do it again.
I think we might be up for another discussion.
Look, we would totally accept that, Lee, so...
Okay. Look, we are out of time, and everyone's been really patient. Some of you have driven, like Bill, enormous distances, others even further to be here tonight. We have had some, I think, really good and informed discussion. I sense that there's lots of commonalities in the room when it comes to some of the specific issues. But thank you to everybody who has been involved in putting this on tonight. It's been a not inconsiderable effort. And may I also thank these people out the front who have taken their time out to be here as well and to have been such a vital part of the conversation. Thank you, one and all. Thank you. Good night.